I just finished recording the second half of the Xenoblade Spirit video audio, and now I have to record an 8,000 word script, so wish me luck. One of the many reasons the Xeno series is so highly regarded is its fantastic villains. Personally, I really like how it tends to have multiple kinds of major villain in the same game, so that the main bad guys will include both sympathetic villains with backstories that allow you to understand why they're fighting against you and/or endearing personalities that make you feel bad when you kill them, and less multi-dimensional, more evil for the sake of being evil villains, where the only love you have for them is a love to hate. Unfortunately, for as great as Xeno can be, the writing surrounding them is sometimes less great, and decreases the impact these characters could have had. The most frequent way this happens is by taking the final villain of a game, who's frequently closer to the latter, less humanized type, and kind of jarringly inserting something where it seems like the writers are trying to get you to not just sympathize with them, but also agree with their viewpoints after they've already been taken out. This not only defeats the purpose of having more simple, designed-to-be-despised villains as a final act after the more emotionally complex characters have been beaten, but also lessens the impact of those complex characters by adding more instances of intended sympathy and trying to make you feel bad for people who are much less deserving of your pity. This may sound like the end of every Xeno game has its issues, but I think that the series has been consistently improving in this regard as it went on, to the point of it being a complete non-issue by Xenoblade 2. Today I'll be analyzing various villains and how the writing surrounding them seems to be pushing you to feel about them, and whether or not any intended sympathies are good or misplaced. I'm going through the entire series chronologically and will compare and contrast later characters to previous ones, so this will contain spoilers for the entire series. Thankfully, I am a merciful person, and am going to split each game into just that game and previous spoiler sections. So Xenogears is just going to be one section, but then Saga is going to be just Saga villain discussion, and then Saga with the context of Gears. Xenoblade 1 is going to be just Xenoblade 1, and then Xenoblade 1 with the context of Gears, Saga, and itself, and stuff like that. So there's going to be a section just for each individual universe, and then for that universe, while also taking into account the evolution based on previous ones. Xenoblade X will not have a discussion about any previous games, because there is very little to talk about Xenoblade X, so it's just getting a section about itself. Anyway, before you dislike the video in a way that only I can see anymore because YouTube is incredibly stupid, yes, there will be more Eggle discussion, but he's going to be an example of the writing not screwing up and clear proof of how it's been improving. Starting with Xenogears, we run into quite a few antagonists who are more on the sympathetic side. While there are plenty of minor characters like Vanderkam and Bishop Stone who are pretty cut and dry evil, even the boss of the worst dungeon of the game, who seems like a mindless beast, ends up getting a sad backstory. This isn't the same thing as a sympathetic villain, of course, since Redrum is a mutated human who no longer has any self-awareness, not a complex sentient individual doing bad things for a good reason, but it just goes to show how much thought went into making as little of the game purely black and white morality. Just think about it. Ellie is the main love interest, and she's an antagonist the first 2 times she appears. As far as more textbook sympathetic villains go, id definitely deserves a mention for more or less being an abused child lashing out, but with far more power than someone in that position would ever normally have. The biggest case in Gears by far, though, is someone with much less charitable views on id than myself, Karan Ramzus. Thankfully, he's one of the rare cases who actually gets to make a full face turn and support the heroes in the end, but it is quite a long journey to get there. Ramzus doesn't particularly have any strong belief in the ideals of Solaris, but he does have an incredibly deep-seated hatred for Faye, which is used by the much less sympathetic villains Krelian and Myong. More on the first one of those later. Myong is mostly just an automaton of Deus who exists basically to be evil, to control him. Ramzus is a genetic clone of Cain, the Emperor of Solaris, whose entire purpose for existence was to kill his genetic donor. It's important to know that he was not raised as a normal child, didn't actually have a human form to begin with, starting life in a tube. This life was almost cut short when Myong, after incarnating in the body of Faye's mother, informed Krelian, in front of the still developing Ramzus, that there was no need for a clone of Cain, as Faye, the contact, had already been reborn. They then simply dumped Ramzus in a trash pile, and he only survived by killing and fusing with a boy, taking over his life. This obviously gave him a massive inferiority complex, despite him being the strongest soldier in Solaris, which is only deepened after getting defeated by id in Elru prior to the story. Despite this, he does still seem to be a caring person, as he recruited the second generation of elements from across social classes, saving the lives of at least 2 of them in the process. Ramzus spends most of Gears in a one-sided rivalry with Faye and id after encountering him in Bloodivik, and quickly putting 2 and 2 together and figuring out the truth about id. He loses very easily when id shows up in the desert, but shows his strength later on at the Thames when he almost kills Faye, leading to the entire Billy Ethos arc. After a second loss, this time to the party with just Faye and no id in sight, he's chewed out by the Gazelle Ministry, furthering his desire to best him. He gets his gear upgraded with an Anima Relic, turning it into the fittingly named Vendetta, dealing Faye a second crushing defeat to end the first disc. He's defeated easily once Veltal is upgraded though, and again in Merkava, after which he and the elements are rescued and brought to the Yggdrasil. He continues to put himself down, but his old colleague Satan is finally able to get through to him, and makes him realize that by doing this, he's also putting down the elements who are willing to die for him. This finally makes him stop living in Faye's shadow and start living for himself and the people who love him, backing the party up in the final battle, a role which seems to have originally involved being playable at one point in development. Despite trying to kill the protagonist on multiple occasions, Rams is still an incredibly sympathetic character, as he was abused, manipulated, and literally thrown in the trash by the people who created him, and the mental issues this gave him are used by those people to control him into doing most of the bad things he does. In a different game, this would just make him another one of the bad guys, but in one as focused on mental health as Xenogears is, this instead makes him by far the most sympathetic villain in the entire game, and one you're glad to see come around and fight on your side at the end. Granted, this coming around might be slightly less impactful when you realize that what does it is a harem of 4 different 90s anime girl tropes reminding him of how much they care for him, depending on where your preferences lie, but he's still one of my favorite characters in Gears, and I might be even more upset at his playable form not making it into the game than Margie's. While Ramses is the big sympathetic villain of Gears, we now need to talk about the big simp villains of Gears. For a game with so many legendary antagonists, it's kind of amazing how many of their motivations boil down to TFW no GF. I've already briefly mentioned Stone, but Graf and Krelian also count here. Out of these 3, Graf is probably the most sympathetic in backstory, as Lacan was actually in a relationship with the woman he's fixated on, and his start of darkness involved being manipulated by Myung, and it was probably the worst moment of his life, after Ellie died sacrificing herself to stop Solaris and begging Lacan to live on. Unfortunately, after the personality of Graf was born due to incomplete contact with the Zohar, it doesn't seem that Lacan was able to reassert himself and stop the things he did, like activating the Diabolos gears, but after his body died, he was put back into the reincarnation loop, eventually ending up as Faye, while Graf had to possess others' bodies to live on. In the game, Graf, inhabiting the body of Faye's father, who occasionally also takes control as Wiseman, spends most of his time trying to bring out Faye's contact powers so he can merge with him and properly interface with the Zohar, but his feelings for Sophia persist, and he's willing to go out of his way to protect her new incarnation Ellie, saving her in Kislev and ultimately sacrificing both himself and Kam to stop the Zohar, as Faye's stopping Deus is the only way to free Ellie from Myung's control. On the other hand, we have Krelian. Coming from the same time period as Lacan, he effectively kidnapped a 13-year-old Sophia for 7 years when he was 23 to protect her, falling in love with her at some point during that time, and of course was upset when she and Lacan got together and devastated when she died. Misinterpreting some of her words about the existence of God, he then vowed to create one himself, teaming up with Myung to revive Deus, taking control of Solaris behind the scenes, which makes him responsible for all of the Empire's atrocities, including the genocide, horrible class structure, and mass-produced cannibalism, while also working on twisted human experiments of his own, and of course, doing everything with Ramses I mentioned before. He's the co-main antagonist with Myung for the entire game, and only begins to show something remotely resembling redeeming qualities after Deus and Ouroboros have already been destroyed, meaning his plans are already completely in ruin. Before the final fight, he has a conversation with Faye where he monologues about how humans are flawed and free will is a lie, so they will always have to experience suffering and loss, which is why it'd be better if things were reverted to how they once were, which just means killing everyone so their souls can become one as waves. Faye obviously rebukes this because deciding to kill everyone because bad things happen is stupid, and after Ouroboros is defeated, Krelian does free Ellie, who comes out with what's probably the stupidest line in the entire series. Apparently, Krelian loved humanity more than anyone else, and wanting to murder everyone to get rid of pain and suffering makes you a good person who should be forgiven actually, and of course Faye agrees with this for some reason. In the anime cutscene that follows, Krelian helps the two get out of the path of Sephiroth and back to reality, and they both try to get him to come back with them because surely the last remnants of the humanity he tried so hard to wipe out would understand if he just explained himself. Thankfully, because the switch has been flipped and Krelian is the only one written with any level of sanity in this scene, he declines, seeing that he committed so many sins and gave up his humanity long ago, and that only God has the right to judge him, so he follows the wave existence to its higher dimension, acknowledging that he might never see them again or cease to exist entirely, and saying that he really does envy their bond. This scene genuinely could have worked well if it was Krelian in defeat coming to a realization that everything he did was bad actually, and deciding to let Faye and Ellie have their happy ending, removing himself from the world as an attempt to atone, but we didn't get that. Instead, we got a terrible person through and through being forgiven by some of the people he hurt the most, and declining their offer of a complete lack of consequences for his actions because he doesn't think he can live life as a normal human anymore and wants to ascend to a higher plane of existence instead. This sudden and unearned buildup of sympathy and forgiveness for someone who doesn't really deserve either is not only bad writing in general, but also has the unfortunate side effect of massively souring what was otherwise a fantastic ending to a game with flaws that were not purely writing-based up until this point. Xenosaga takes a somewhat different approach to its villains. While Gears had a reformed villain end up a major party member, one immensely sympathetic villain and a bunch of largely irredeemable ones, the second iteration of Xeno instead gives some sympathetic traits to most of its lesser villains, and makes the final antagonist of the series among the worst people imaginable. We should start with Albedo, as he is effectively the main antagonist of about a game and a half of the series, which amounts to about half of all canon Xenosaga content, even with Pied Piper and Missing Year included. He's shown to have a pretty sympathetic backstory, but despite all of the horrible things he does have the ambiguously valid excuse of having been driven insane by contact with Udu, turning him into a sadomasochistic nihilist with the goal of killing all of humanity. It's this version of him we see throughout the entire series besides the episode 2 flashbacks, and while we see he was clearly troubled as a kid, being subject to violent outbursts among other things, we can't really tell how much of his views on the weakness and pointlessness of humanity came from the Udu interaction, so it's completely possible that he should be absolved of all of his actions before his revival as a testament, or he could have just had his inhibitions removed and worldview warped, keeping him squarely on the hook for everything. What is known is that he's still influenced by his younger self's personality, as his affection for Junior prevents him from ever killing him, and he progresses from wanting to reunite with him as they were conjoined twins, to wanting to die by his hand, which he does accomplish at the end of episode 2. He's brought back as a testament by Wilhelm soon after, and when he shows up in the third game he's noticeably more stable, and while he does go along with Wilhelm's plan for most of the game, he ultimately does side with Guinan and Junior in order to destroy Yuriev and the fragments of Udu still within him for good. Due to consciousness swapping shenanigans, his ends up joining with Junior's and going dormant for the time being, but not before letting his brother know where to go next. His last acknowledgements are by Wilhelm, who says that Albedo got his wish, and then by Momo, who wants Junior to say hi to him for her, with Rubido agreeing to do so, suggesting at the very least that Momo thinks this post-Udu contamination Albedo is a fundamentally different, better person than contaminated Albedo, as she was the main cast member who he hurt the most, and the most uncomfortably throughout the series. Now for a bit of a lightning round on the lesser sympathetic villains. Cherenkov has a horrible backstory involving being a genetically engineered soldier with PTSD who was unable to adjust to civilian life, having undergone personality reconditioning twice, and an abusive marriage before ultimately being rescued by Margulis and joining UTIC, where he seems to be well respected. Just as an aside, Cherenkov's wife, and not Cherenkov himself, is listed as an antagonist on the Xenogears Xenosaga wiki, so that kinda goes to show how sympathetic the fandom is towards him. While his ultimate goal is to steal Cosmos, he's still fairly respectful towards Shion and doesn't like it when he snaps and hurts others, but he's unfortunately separated from the party, traumatized and transformed into a Gnosis on the Cathedral ship, where the main characters are forced to kill him, which they regret. His last conversation is one with Shion, and is about people being conditioned to kill and being hooked on drugs, being unable to integrate into civilian society through no fault of their own. Louis Virgil is another former soldier who's violent, abrasive, and racist against Realians in the present. His backstory involved being a fighter in the Miltian conflict tasked with killing Realians, where his life was saved by Fabronia, a half-Realian and nanny to Shion, with whom he started a relationship. He claims that being with her was the only time he felt at peace, but this was short-lived as she gave her life buying time for Virgil and Shion to escape from some combat Realians who ended up eating her in front of them. This sent him on a downward spiral that pretty clearly led him down the path to make him what he is in episode 1, especially when coupled with an addiction to Realian flesh caused by a transplant of Fabronia's organs. He's killed by Cosmos accidentally and brought back as the Blue Testament, where he mostly stays masked in the background until episode 3. His final appearance is in the memory of Milsha after the past version of himself sacrifices his life. His consciousness is tied to the time and place of Fabronia's death, and he tries to call Shion out on her hypocrisy while hinting at the Red Testament's identity, only to be defeated in battle and reunited with Fabronia's spirit, who finally gets him to understand his own hypocrisy before they finally pass on together. Margulis starts out the series as a pretty not sympathetic person, but by the end of episode 3, he and Pellegrini do sort of end up there, as they're both zealots of Ormus, but eventually learn that it's just another organization controlled by Wilhelm, and that their faith was completely taken for granted. Margulis believes that his life has no more purpose, beyond a final duel with Jin, and he commits suicide after being defeated. And then we have the bad ones, the characters I have zero sympathy for whatsoever. Dmitry Yuriev is a corrupt politician who wants to destroy Udu. He's a eugenicist, an abusive father, and responsible for a massive number of deaths across the backstory and series proper. He's also regarded as the original Voyager, as he bankrolled a pre-Black Testament Eric Weber, a man who's so scared of Udu he's addicted to murder because it makes him feel powerful again, and used his Yuriev connections to become a cop because he knew it'd let him get away with it easier. Fuck both of them. My sentiments toward the last two Saga characters are pretty much the same. Wilhelm and Kevin are horrible people who are shown a small amount of sympathy within episode 3, and while not as bad as the Gears case, is probably still more than they deserve. Wilhelm is the ultimate villain of the entire Xenosaga series, and a master manipulator who controls most of the major factions at play throughout it. He's a guardian of the lower domain created by the collective unconsciousness with the purpose of avoiding the collapse of the universe. He arrives at the goal of eternal recurrence, constantly resetting the universe to avoid its destruction. His means to achieve this are genocidal at best, as much of the suffering in the series was indirectly caused by him, and he doesn't seem to place much value in the feelings of humans, having shown sadistic tendencies multiple times. He's a master manipulator, playing all of humanity for the express purpose of killing them, and enabling all of the awful things Kevin did as well. One could argue that he's seen the universe repeat over and over again and was driven to insanity and/or nihilism, but the perfect guide confirms that his memories are reset as well, and that he comes to the same realization independently every loop. He might not be human, but that doesn't excuse his inhuman and inhumane actions. Kevin, on the other hand, is a much more viscerally terrifying character. Taken in at a young age by Wilhelm, who preyed on his despair at the death of his mother to get him to believe recurrence is the right choice, he was tasked with getting Xion, the reincarnation of the Maiden of Mary, into the proper position for eternal recurrence to occur. This involved him starting a relationship with her when she was 8 and he was 14 that lasted until he intentionally got killed by Cosmos so he could become a Testament and connect Xion emotionally to the android. He then later returns in Red Testament form, primarily in episode 3, where he continues his abusive manipulative tactics to try and get Xion to side with him, which she briefly does before her friends finally get her to see how much of a horrible person he truly is. The most twisted part is that he does seem to have genuinely developed feelings for her, albeit in an extremely controlling way, as he tries to save her multiple times during the confrontation with Wilhelm, including giving his Testament second life to ensure her survival. They share a goodbye where he finally seems to let her go and she agrees to move on, which may seem a bit too friendly for what's actually happened, but I do think it works in this situation. Keep in mind, Xion is absolutely an abuse victim in this case, and has come to the realization that Kevin is a toxic, horrible person within a couple hours of this conversation occurring, so her still having mixed feelings and looking at him fondly is completely understandable here, as there's no way she could have reasonably processed everything that quickly, even in a less stressful environment than the literal end of the universe. So many people think Xion is a bad and annoying character because of some of her actions at the end of the series, and 99% of their arguments are straight victim blaming, which disgusts me every time I see it. It's worth noting that literally nobody else displays any sympathy for Kevin when he shows up in episode 3. Most of them either yell at or outright try to kill him. It's just Xion still being affected by the years of manipulation, so I think this is still an appropriate treatment of his character, even if I wish she had the time to process her trauma and could tell him off, leaving him rejected in death. He deserves to get that send-off, but what he does get makes sense for how the story has progressed up until that point. Wilhelm, on the other hand, is a little more contentious. The character with the most history with him, Chaos, the guy who is basically his exact antithesis, doesn't seem to harbor any hatred for him. Margulis seems to hate his manipulations more than any of the party members, and nobody seems to comment on him at all after he vanishes. Side note, I say vanish here because Wilhelm didn't die. He seemingly just went dormant after his plans were thwarted, and it's implied that he'll take physical form again to protect humanity if Xion and friends don't find an answer to the heat death of the universe. In the epilogue, Xion comments that she understands his goals and logic despite his methods being wrong, which I do somewhat take umbrage with. Even if he was primarily formed by the consciousness of humanity and had the ultimate goal of stopping the collapse of the universe, I think he deserves to be remembered in a less flattering way than his methods are wrong but I get the logic, largely because his logic was still kill everyone. It's mostly that doesn't sit right with me, and it's a big sticking point, but it doesn't really do much to damage my opinion of how perfect the ending of Xenosaga is otherwise. And now for the previous spoiler section. While most characters are fairly original concepts, Kevin and Wilhelm do seem to be some form of evolution of Graf and Krelian respectively, and I especially think Wilhelm was far better handled. Krelian got an entire speech about how he's a good guy actually, while Wilhelm only got a tacit acknowledgement of how his ultimate goal was to protect everyone, which is a marked improvement, though not necessarily a perfect one. Graf and Kevin's similarities are a bit more surface level, being driven to evil by loss of a loved one, and both are equally effective in different ways. Graf is a delight to watch ham it up on every occasion, while Kevin is by far the more disturbing villain, because his worst acts are smaller scale and very realistic. There isn't one big terrible writing moment like the Krelian forgiveness in Saga, but depending on your view of his character, Albedo definitely got off with basically a slap on the wrist and a self-imposed nap after all he did, and the party's views on Wilhelm are still not as negative as they probably should be, Chaos's excuse notwithstanding, so it definitely still isn't perfect. Xenoblade 1 is the first instance in the series of doing a sympathetic, tragic villain perfectly on the atoning for past atrocities / redemption side of things, on 2 separate occasions no less, but still suffers from an absolutely terrible writing moment connected to antagonist Sympathy, and one badly written antagonist, plus an unsympathetic ally character in Future Connected, but more on that later. It also makes a very clear distinction between sympathetic and hateable villains, with the exception of the bad writing moment, which I think lends a better structure to things. Let's go through the hateable ones first. Yumea and Lorithia are very one-dimensional terrible people, and for bonus points they are primarily Melia antagonists, which makes you hate them even more. Jadeface is purely brainwashed, so he doesn't exactly have a say in the matter, despite managing to partly break free anyway. Zord isn't brainwashed, but he does seem to be confused and driven partially insane by face conversion, so he could arguably be seen as a tragic character as well, not completely in control of his own actions and only driven by primal hunger. Both he and Mumkar I view as fairly generic characters with not a lot going for them, who are elevated immensely by fantastic voice performances in the dub, which is not surprising when they're voiced by Xenoblade 2 Mui Mui and Urianger goddamn Ajurel respectively. We're talking about faces, so I guess I'll throw Nemesis in here too, as she is technically an antagonist for a bit, despite just being the purely benevolent Maineth. Alvis is also expressly not a bad person, despite posing as a disciple of Zenza, though he is probably more of a neutral, morally ambiguous character than Maineth, and Zenza himself is a pretty cut-and-dry and megalomaniacal evil god without much depth, who is probably the second most boring final antagonist in the series, only behind a character from a game I haven't talked about yet, who I'm not even going to discuss at all in this video because of how nothing they are. I want to start with the good before we get to the bad, so let's talk about the two fantastic sympathetic villains, though this will admittedly be brief as I've made multiple videos dedicated to them before. If we only count the base game, Tyree is simply a kind of terrible person with clear seeds for a redemption arc planted, but Future Connected outright gives her most of that arc. She starts as an indoctrinated assassin for a racial purity espousing murder cult trying to keep the half-homs Melia from taking the throne, but ends as Melia's supporter from the shadows, having learned of her own mixed heritage, witnessing the sordid truth behind Bionis worship, including the transformation and death of her mother, and finding a younger brother in Teelan. She's dedicated herself to the success of the new mixed-race Alchemoth community, while also working to find a cure to the Telethia transformation to bring back as many purebloods as she can. She's even given a foil in Galgar, and is probably the one to strongest reject his viewpoint of mixed Entia purity and leaving the purebloods to die. Xeno doesn't often fully redeem villains, but since Xenoblade 1 is the first game expressly inspired by a genre pioneered by Dragon Ball, it's not surprising that it did it first, and she's an example of a redemption arc done right. Egil, on the other hand, is a great example of noble intentions gone awry. He started out wanting to stop Zenza, which is obviously Shulk's ultimate goal, but decided that the best way to do so was to cut off his power source by killing all the people of Bionis. This makes it the rare case of someone wanting to commit targeted genocide for a reason that isn't outright hatred for another race, which doesn't make it any less bad, just more unique, increasing the memorability of his character. Keep in mind, yeah, the killing is bad enough, but he does also have all the remaining Machina living in fear of him, and experiments with Ham's bodies and brainwashing to create the faces, and turned against Maineth herself, so after the several thousand years he's been against Zenza, he's definitely drifted from ends justify the means revenge at all costs to outright war criminal, but he's still a great mirror to Shulk, who himself is learning to let go of revenge. Despite this, he does still seem to regret having to do the horrible things he did, and after a conversation with Shulk, he is willing to accept peace, turning to Maineth again. Shulk is, of course, unfortunately shot before they have a chance to shake on it, though. At this point, he is wholly on the side of the party, and uses his final attack to open the way to the heart of the Bionis. He acknowledges his atrocities and apologizes for them, begging Shulk to survive and fight on to save both their worlds. The thing with that is that, while yes, he is acting heroically here, this one set of actions is not enough to redeem him of millennia of terror and aggression, and Egil acknowledges this. The cool part is where he takes it a step further and actually mentions the very trope that many of his fans fall victim to when they forgive everything he did, by saying that he will be judged not by the atrocities he committed in most of his life, but in this one major heroic act at that life's end. The saddest part about this isn't the fact that he and Shulk would obviously be good friends, but that Machina lived for thousands of years, and he's far from an old man, so it's not unreasonable to say that he would have actually been able to fully redeem himself if he had the rest of his lifetime to do so, but that, like so many other lives, was cut short by the curse of Zenza. Putting the Bird Lady enthusiasm aside, Egil is by far the best villain in Xenoblade 1. Sadly though, it's time to get a little less charitable toward the writing. Firstly, while Mumkar himself doesn't have any writing issues, there is that one infamous scene around him where Shulk stops Dunban from killing him. This is stupid for several reasons, but the worst is probably his reasoning being, he's a Homs. There was absolutely zero indication that Metalface wasn't his own sentient being prior to the reveal of his identity, which means that Shulk didn't see the issue in killing a sentient being until he learned that it was actually a modified Homs, which has all sorts of obvious issues with it. the party hasn't intentionally killed any sentient being yet, even Zord was a mistake. So the discussion should be whether or not it's worth crossing that line for revenge, not, no Dunban, don't kill him, he's a Homs and so is Fiora and you wouldn't kill her, right? Face Nemesis hasn't even fought the party at this point, so crossing the line potentially leading to Fiora's death shouldn't even be a concern since she's not even an antagonist. This entire scene is capped off with the additional stupidity of Mumkar accidentally killing himself, completely absolving everyone of having to make a tough moral choice, which is probably the most anti-Xeno thing you could possibly do in that situation. Then there's Dixon, who could have been a neat sympathetic villain who had to raise Shulk in order to see Zanza's return, but ended up seeing him as a son, but instead, we got fake good guy Dixon and evil Dixon, who are basically two completely different characters. Every hint that he's going to betray the party before he actually does so makes him seem like he feels bad about it, but then he shoots Shulk and immediately becomes a gloating generic villain with no personality or even hints of the personality he used to have, right up until he dies and decides not to let Shulk see him pass, suggesting he still cares for him in some way, but embodying the refuses to elaborate, dies meme in its worst form. He is a waste of a perfectly good character in all regards. Finally, we hit Future Connected, which doesn't have any sympathetic villains at all, because the Fog King and Galgar both aren't fleshed out enough to elicit any feeling other than kill him, I guess, in the first place. Instead, it has people it wants you to feel bad for, but I just end up hating. My script here says Maxis is a racist hypocrite, which probably isn't enough explanation, so I'll try to elaborate. Maxis and the companions left Grandel because they blamed the Machina for Egil's atrocities, despite him seemingly being a lone wolf with only captured Homs and literal faceless machines working for him who oppressed the Machina just as much as the Homs. They also consider Radzim stupid for telling them to stop going on suicide missions to retake Alchemoth, when surprise surprise, the Fog King ends up being beaten by going in with an actual plan that Radzim helped with. They also seem to look down on the Machina for not helping fight against the Mechon, despite them literally doing nothing when the Homs were almost wiped out, something Kellyan, a much better person than any of the companions, already apologized for. Add to that the hypocrisy of the whole divine right of kings reclaim the homeland thing that they're trying to do, in front of the Machina whose ancestral home was destroyed by transformed Hyantia, and you've got some high-tier elitist dickery from half-blooded Hyantia who seem to have learned nothing from how badly it's implied they were treated by their full-blooded brethren. Maxis also only agrees to help Grandel because his family's in danger, not because he realized it was the right thing to do, that he was being a pig-headed baby whining that the mean metal man told him not to throw his life away from misplaced glory. And he's too stupid to realize that Melia is the crown princess, despite being a veteran of the guard, her name being said around him before, and Galgar, another companion, knowing who she is, so he's really one of the worst written characters in the entire series, especially out of the ones you're supposed to like. I think I hate him more than Galgar after writing this, in all honesty. And now, Xenoblade 1 with previous spoiler context. While 1's shallow villains are even shallower than most Gears and Saga ones, and Tyrea is a largely original character concept done really well, Egil is the Krellian/Wilhelm idea done right for the first time. Instead of having a vague desire to save humanity, he instead outright has the same specific goal as the heroes, and just went at it in an absolutely terrible way, driven to cross the line many times by thousands of years of being alone. This also contrasts with Zanza's alleged desire to have friends, as I actually believe that Egil would want them. He's shown to have a good relationship with Arglis, and unlike Zanza, I think he's actually capable of seeing others as equals and not people to be lorded over. The villain the game makes you feel bad for the most, not being the final one, is also a good decision, as you can go into the last battle without any hesitation, taking the sympathetic villain's desire for a better world alongside the hopes and dreams of everyone else who was lost along the way to grant you strength in your toughest trials. He's also a foil to the main character instead of just being a big monolithic, bad guy you can't relate to. Unfortunately, while Egil's great, Tyrea makes me feel a lot of things, and having a lot of shallow villains isn't inherently bad, the complete butchering of Mumkar's death and Dixon's betrayal, as well as the mistake that is basically everything involving the companions, makes it hard to say that this universe did the whole sympathy thing the best. Xenoblade X is going to be a really short one to go through, as basically all of its villains are one-dimensional at most, so Lao is the only antagonist in the main story to have any sense of depth. I find him to be an extremely sympathetic character, both because side quests make it very obvious how his backstory ended up happening, and because an instance of the game's social commentary aging well in a bad way. In his big speech in Cauldros, he outlines to Lin that only the rich and powerful had guaranteed spots on the White Whale, but based on the way he says people like us when referring to those with useful talents being saved, and the fact that it's Lao Huang talking to Lin Li Ku, it's probable that he was also referring to racism as well as just general corruption. Take that and combine it with Lao being an Asian, likely Chinese man, then do the math with his age and you'll realize that he's set to be born within the next few years, and couple that with the multiple stupid reasons Asian people in the US, where the white whale is from, have been experiencing discrimination that started after X was written, and it becomes extremely likely that his family, when he was younger, went through even more than the original writers intended, making him an even more sympathetic antagonist than he was supposed to be. Seeing people like Alex in NLA drives home that the worst of the worst really were saved, making everything surrounding Lao all the more melancholy. This obviously doesn't make him selling what's left of humanity out to the ganglion any better, but it does make me root for him to redeem himself later, because he is seemingly revived at the end of the game after having a change of heart and giving his life to stop Luxar, so hopefully we do get a cool redemption arc out of him if an X2 is ever in the cards. Xenoblade 2 takes a different route from its predecessor, as it focuses almost entirely on a purely sympathetic group of antagonists who feel just as much like a found family as the heroic party, can use the power of friendship just as well, and would probably be good guys in a more just world, with an ultimate main villain being the Krellian concept done to perfection, and the generically evil mustache twirlers relegated to minor or comedy villain status. I won't talk a lot about those, but Dougal, Mui Mui, and Bana are all incredibly fun to watch, the latter especially due to his fantastic English voice performance by the late Stephen Critchlow, may he rest in peace. I'm not considering Morag as a villain here, more a temporary antagonist, as her antagonism is purely fueled by a misunderstanding. We only get her sympathetic backstory after she joins the party, and destroying the water tower is legitimately kind of a dick move to all the residents of Torgoth who probably relied on it for clean water. For similar reasons, I also won't be talking about Vandam and Zeke, and Eulagiminamimina is also technically a villain, but he's nothing to write home about in any regard, so I don't want to dedicate any time to him. Jin and Mikhail even get an entire shorter game expressly detailing the tragedy that made them who they are in the present day, that also sets up just how damn good of a hate-sink villain Amalthus is. All of present-day Torna is set up to be sympathetic, despite the fact that we only really get a full backstory for Jin and Mick, as early as Chapter 3, as we've already seen Nia flashing back to being treated well by Jin, as well as Akos genuinely being distraught over Abrona's death. We never really learn a lot about him and Petroka, but just knowing that they're flesh-eaters is enough to explain how they reached the views on humanity that they have, as we can make a pretty educated guess on what they must have went through based on Nia's backstory. Melos is arguably the most unhinged Torna member with the least respect for life, but even he clearly cares about his friends and is physically unable to change core aspects of his personality because of Amalthus' influence, though the ability to care for others at all already makes him a better person than his driver. Melos acknowledging himself that he's irredeemable, but also lamenting the fact that he can't change, is a fantastic rumination on free will and the nature of humanity that just makes you want to punch Amalthus in his smug blue mouth even more, because you want Melos to be able to make the healthy decisions that would lead to a better, healthier life for him and his friends, but he can't because he was unlucky enough to have been awoken by someone who hates the world. We've seen Mithra. A Melos with influence from a better driver could be an incredible force of good, and just a fantastic person to have around. Speaking of Amalthus hating the world, he's a textbook bad things happened to me and I saw the worst of humanity so I went full nihilist guy, but with a twist. Just getting to that point already pushed Minoff away from him, proving he couldn't form a meaningful bond with his blades before ever awakening Melos, and he just got worse from there. Hating the world wasn't enough for the guy, so he decided to spend the next 500 years effectively taking it over just so he could eventually destroy it. It says something that 4 of the 5 members of Torna died fighting against Amalthus, not the party, and the 5th was only killed by them by accident when they had full intentions of sparing him and trying to bring him to see reason, as his motivations were in large part still influenced by Amalthus even after his death. Klaus is almost a foil to Amalthus, as he destroyed the world in an attempt to become a god and fix humanity's mistakes, and carried on hating humanity even after he recreated it, until Rex and Co. showed him that there's still reason to have hope. The interesting thing, though, is that he has no backstory whatsoever pre-Conduit, let alone a sympathetic one like losing his mother at a young age and saving the life of someone who went on to take the life of another, but I still hate him less than Smurf Pope. He at least acknowledges his foolishness and apologizes for the suffering everyone went through, while also genuinely hoping they succeed and giving them a new world full of possibilities when they do. He's far from perfect, but he's also the first one who would admit that, and has spent countless years trying to fix his mistakes, so I'm fairly quick to forgive him, even without feeling bad for him, though my opinion would likely differ if I was one of the people killed by his experiment. There aren't really any pieces of sympathy weirdness in all of Xenoblade 2's main story. I feel bad for a lot of the villains, love to hate the main one, and love to watch all the rest. Outside of side quests, there aren't even really any people I disagree with the portrayal of or views the game has on. Reese is incredibly annoying and from the worst part of the game, but that doesn't mean I disagree with Rex or anyone else's treatment of him and his situation. 2 is a triumph of character writing as a whole, and I think my lack of any criticism when approaching it from this angle is a clear indicator of why. And lastly, we end on Xenoblade 2 while talking about previous spoilers. No Xeno game prior to 2 had an antagonist squad with the power of friendship, and I think adding one worked wonders for the philosophical themes that are always present in the series, and finally created a cast that I don't have any major writing issues with in the sympathy department. Trust me, the Mithra bed scene is still awful, but it isn't trying to create sympathy for someone who doesn't deserve it, and when combined with the rest of the character isn't enough to make me dislike someone who clearly does deserve it. Additionally, if Egil is the Krellian concept done right, Amalthus is the actual Krellian character done right. They have a very similar backstory and worldview, only losing a different type of loved one, as well as a similar goal, similar level of control over the world achieved in pursuit of that goal, and a similar proclivity towards human experimentation. He's not as outwardly twisted as Krellian was, but Amalthus is made arguably better by the complete lack of excuses or positive connotations to any of his actions. The series has finally learned that "I lost someone I love and grew to hate the world, so I want to destroy it" is a mindset that shouldn't be given the time of day by anyone, in-universe or out, and making him the root cause of all the sympathetic villains just hammers this home even more. Melos is similar to Albedo in a way, as I feel disgust for his actions, but also pity for his state of being, because he's absolutely not fully in control of himself and would clearly improve as a person if he was. We don't know if Udo Albedo was actually not in control, but after losing the contamination he ultimately made a bunch of textbook good guy moves, so I'm betting that a Melos cleansed of Amalthus' influence would be a hero as well. Thankfully, there's always the AUs of him being awoken by Rex and my theory that one Empyra and Mithric became Numa and the other Logos when they gained separate bodies, to give me hope that he might be showing up in a better role in the future. And lastly, I said Zanza was boring in the Xenoblade 1 segment, and I'm sticking by that because he didn't actually have a character until this game. Evil God Zanza is an incredibly flat character until you see more of him as Klaus and meet his other half. Xenoblade 2 is the only reason he's interesting at all, and even then it's the Klaus half that has all the thematic relevance and philosophical quandaries attached to him. Regular Zanza, without the Xenoblade 2 context, is kind of incredibly boring. And that's it! That's this video! This is something I've wanted to make for such a long time, and I'm so happy it's finally done, because trust me, my voice is very, very, very sore. So thank you all for watching. I'm betting a lot of you disagree with a lot of the things I said, and I'm excited about that because this is an extremely subjective thing, so disagreement is more welcomed and less looked down on because you're not being objectively wrong. Don't be objectively wrong. That's not a good thing to do. I mean, if you're saying that anyone I talked about who killed a lot of people was justified in that, you are objectively wrong. But that's not the subjective stuff that I'm talking about. So thank you to all the patrons who you saw on screen previously for continuing to support me in their own various ways. And until next time, which is going to be literally tomorrow, this is Luxon, signing off.